Hello, hello. Thank you everyone for being here today. Today we're lucky enough to get to speak with J.W. Judge, author of Casual Business with Fairies. And first and foremost, just hats off to you. There aren't very many opportunities where I get to read something that's just so far off the beaten path in terms of genre, in terms of style. Because I read this as a legal thriller with a fantasy twist, an element to it. And I felt that all the little aspects, whether it be fantasy, whether it be law, whether it be their travels between realms, I thought it all added to the story. And at no point did I find myself lost, or I feel like a lot of times with stories like these where it's jumping from perspectives or from realms, I'm like, oh, get me back to the fairy world, get me back to the real world. I thought this was all just balanced really, really well. So again, hats off to you. It was a fantastic story.
All right, great. Thank you.
Steve, what are you doing?
Sorry, while you guys are doing this, I'm trying to make sure the sun isn't illuminating half my screen. Forgive me. Right, I'm sorted now. So, Casual Business with Fairies I felt like it was a mashup of like Suits and dark fairy tale kind of twists. I know anything that deals with the fairy, I've always been a fan of. I remember, I think it was Hellboy that I seen first that did it. And I went, oh, that's neat. I've never thought about that before. So one of the first notes that I took was when I'd read a line and I put down to ask for a clarification of how much research we'd done into this. Are teeth bones? Do teeth count as bones?
You know, I have wondered that too, because my daughter, she's 6, and she came home the other day and they've been learning about bones in class, and she was like, "Did you know there's 212 bones in the body?" And then I was trying to figure out, are teeth bones or not? And like I'm still not sure how those classify.
I really like those little nods. There was quite a lot of little references to our world in it, which is always nice to read in a kind of portal fantasy. The first thing that I wanted to ask, because I want to get all these kind of questions out before we end up diving into spoilers, is how much of the references are just things that you really liked? You know, there was Brother, Wherefore Art Thou, which is a great film. I remember there was Eminem nods and stuff as well. How much of your own taste went into that?
Some of it is mine, some of it is just things I'm familiar with and I think fit. But I will say that the main character in this book more closely resembles me than anybody else that I've written. And I think that's in part because I'm a lawyer. And so, you know, a lot of the work that I do relates to insurance coverage and defending insurance companies and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to, in as much as was interesting, incorporate like his skills as a lawyer into the plot without it being like strictly, you know, John Grisham novel or anything like that. But I wanted his expertise to play a real factor in how things come out. And so, you know, I think that really lent itself to borrowing parts of myself and the things that interest me and throwing them in where they fit without being too extraneous.
Well, and I think that shown throughout the story because, like you said, this is real. What made the story so enjoyable to myself, at least, was you had blended the fairies and the fantasy with the real life in a way that felt believable, in a way that felt like, oh, this isn't so over the top, this isn't far-fetched. And obviously, anything fantasy is going to be a little far-fetched, but it isn't so unfathomable, you know what I mean? And when they're going through, whether it be the scenes in the library or they're looking for the specific parks and this and that, I think it's just the way you kind of went about balancing all of that and then taking in your actual experience, kind of all turned around real nicely. I had my I had my pop culture moment while I was reading it, thinking of that one Tooth Fairy movie with Dwayne the Rock Johnson, and that happens.
Yeah, it's hard to escape the rock these days.
It's very true. I'd like to know a little bit more about your own background as a lawyer, because I didn't realize until I started reading this book that obviously obviously fairies and the fae have so much to do with contracts and things like guarantees, double crossing, and stuff like that. You know, all these fables and fairy tales that they're part of usually have them being like tricksters. Was that did you immediately know that it was going to be a law story with fairies in it, or did it start as a fairy story with law in it?
So it started in, it's probably a bizarre, it was certainly unexpected way for me as far as where the idea catalyzed. And
Mhm.
I'm in an online chat group for a group of lawyers, and we have a whole bunch of channels in there, and one of them is a parents channel. And there is one of the lawyers is from the Pacific Northwest in the United States, and she's she is admittedly different from most of the rest of us, and in a lot of different ways. And one of the things we're talking about the Tooth Fairy at one point, because everybody has different age kids, and she said something to us the effect of, in our house, we don't do casual business with fairies. And those, like those four words, they stuck. They made an impression. And so I just wrote it down. I was in the middle of writing another book at the time, but I just like I have a spreadsheet with all my story ideas. Because I'm that much of a nerd that even my story stuff, it all goes into a spreadsheet. And so, I just wrote down that, and like I'm coming back to this. And then, I just kind of that just percolated for a while. And even when I was working on that third novel, this idea was just like there formulating. And so I didn't really know how all of it was gonna tie together. But I was listening to a podcast interview several years ago with uh and a horror author, and I forget his name all of a sudden. And anyway, he said, you should write about the things that scare you. And so for me, as a dad of small children and, a wife, people that I'm supposed to take care of, the idea of those things being taken away from me is really a theme that is in the first four novels that I've written of like, and
Mhm.
so, and I wasn't somebody who had read a lot about fairies and the fae. So I did a bunch of research and realized that like his training as a lawyer and their reliance on, very technical promises and betrayals and that sort of thing, these things can tie together and be really interesting in where, if you cross the faith and, go back on your word, there are consequences. And so, yeah, those things came together, but that wasn't really, I didn't have an intent when I started out. And so it just, when I did the research that I put into it, those things all kind of fell together.
Tell me a little bit more about the research. I love the kind of inspirations and stuff that we get from we're going diving looking for it. Sometimes inspiration just strikes out of nowhere, like your friend says something that sounds like a good title for a book or something. But I love when authors go deliberately looking in the kind of things that they find. So, like, what kind of research did you do? Where did you go searching?
So a bunch of research about fairies generally. And then also, uh, for me, Ireland has always seemed like a very fantastical place. And
Yeah,
I knew that part of the story was going to take place there. I was last in Ireland 20 years ago. And so when I realized that we're going to move part of the story there, I had to do a bunch of research about Dublin. And they're not there very long, but I want to make sure it feels like you're there. And so I
Mhm.
couldn't rely on memory. I did Google Street View to just be able to walk through the streets again. Um, and then when I was there, I was in Sligo, and our host, he took us up to Knocknarea, and there's the legend of
Yeah,
Knocknarea that's where Queen Maeve is buried. And the last thing that she said was that she wanted to be buried there so that she could keep an eye over her people after she was dead, and she was awful and everybody hated her. And so they buried her there. But then everybody who climbs up Knocknarea since then, you're supposed to take a rock with you and throw it on top of her burial place to keep her from coming back from the dead. And
Mhm.
being awful. And so, I had to do some research into her background and the story behind her because I knew I wanted to, incorporate her into this story because it seemed like it just was a really good fit. So, throughout, and even in the parts of Birmingham that where I live and, am every day, I've got to make sure I get those details right because I want these places to feel lived in, and not just, you know, like a setup for a play or something that you could take down a minute later. I want it to feel like an actual place where you're walking through. And so from the places that I haven't been in 20 years to the places that I entirely made up, I had to make sure, that other fantasy realm with the fairies, that it's consistent internally with their own folklore rules. So there was a lot of research, and most of it doesn't make itself into the writing, but it informs the writing.
Yeah, I've only recently kind of become aware of the breadth of fairy related literature that's out there. And when you go looking for it, oh my god, it's everywhere. It's a real subgenre of its own. Uh, so I know that there's a lot of tropes and stuff like that that usually come with fairy stories. They're the good setup for a pretty standard kind of story that gets repeated maybe a bit often these days. Everything has its trend time. But I feel like this stood out from them and that it didn't feel like an excuse for a kind of run of the mill genre effort. It felt like the merging of two genres, and it brought all my favorite parts of, like you said, like a John Grisham novel or something. I wrote at one point in my notes, this would make a really good episode of Suits, where like a fairy comes needing an insurance policy or something. I just
Yeah.
love that. Is there any other genre that you'd really like to blend insurance lawyer with?
So I don't know about insurance lawyer particularly, but I'm writing a story right now about, so there is, and I'm about 7 chapters away from finishing the first draft. So like we're
Nice,
closing in
nice.
on the 6th novel here. Um, but it's about well, I live in Birmingham. About 45 minutes to the northwest of us is a county called Walker County. And it is known, like there's news stories about it of like you can hire a hitman pretty cheap in Walker County. Like if you
Right.
need somebody killed, there's people there who are willing to do it for money. And so is a story about the intersection of a family of hillbilly hitmen from Walker County and coal country, and a podcaster who comes to town to research a missing persons for a true crime podcast and how their lives
Mhm.
intersect. But also built into that is, the young woman who's the main character, like she has a relationship with her, like a business relationship with her lawyer. And so they
Mhm.
have some interesting dynamics. And I think they have some interesting scenes where, that comes together because even people who live outside of the law need to make sure that they have legal representation when they need it. And so I'd find ways to build it in even when it's not a focus of a story because it's the thing that I know.
And I think
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I think building off of that, things that weren't necessarily a focus of the story, but still really added to it. You had the relationship between Scott, his ex-wife, the daughter. You had that dynamic going around the whole time. And like you said, it goes back to the whole like you want to protect your family, you want to protect the people you care about. And that's whether or not he's still with his partner still matters to him. They have a kid together, and there's so many implications that come from that make it really real. But I think their relationship in general really stood out to me because it felt like it didn't just feel like a side bit. It obviously it wasn't. It was one of the main factors of the story, but it wasn't the key factor of the story. But at the same time, within the how am I phrasing this? It was done in a way where the relationship still felt really real and it felt realistic as well.
Yeah, and that was important to me that since this whole thing for him is about protecting his family, you need to see what those relationships look like and how they affect each other. And it's not always healthy. And sometimes it's really unhealthy. But that doesn't make the that sense for him of making sure they're taken care of is, it doesn't make it any less imperative. And so, yeah, again, and it's not, you know, you don't have a ton of chapters with them together, but I think that those chapters that you do have allows those feelings to permeate throughout the story, and you can understand his motivation.
Yeah, it was exactly that. Is the fact that they certainly did not have the healthiest of relationships at time, but ultimately like their safety really trumps all.
Mhm.
So it doesn't matter if you have your arguments or your tiffs or whatever they may be. Like when it comes to I want to make sure you're okay, that's what's most important, which was nice to see.
Did you put did you put your own experiences of fatherhood into those scenes as well?
Somewhat, although certainly I have a different relationship with my wife than they had. But you know, it's just as far as those conversations with a kid and what they look like, and you
Mhm.
know, they can be both really unexpectedly insightful about things. Like 'cause I never, you know, I've got a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I never know what they're gonna say or where it's gonna come from. And so, you know, in my first novel, Vulcan Rising, it was the same thing. I had a kid about the same age. And some of the scenes from those books came directly out of interactions that I had with my boy, who was then 5 or 6 years old. And so, you know, like you have just this magical moment of innocence in, you know, kids that age, and that also can be really wise for reasons that they have no idea are wise and interesting. And so, yeah, definitely my own experiences as a dad educated some of that.
And do you also ride a motorcycle?
So I did. I haven't in years now, but actually the first couple of chapters where he's going on a motorcycle trip were
Mhm.
taken out of a trip that I took, and I had planned to write a memoir about. And in fact, I cut a couple of chapters out that like came after that. But then I realized that like my memoir wasn't going to be particularly insightful or interesting, and I didn't necessarily have anything to say that would make it worthwhile. But I still thought those stories were interesting or had the bones of things that were interesting. And so I took it and I just brought it right over into this story. And you know, and built the structure of the story into that so that it related and was pertinent. But yeah, those, you know, that first couple chapters there where he's on the motorcycle trip were immediately out of my own life.
And I think that's really cool. And that's really interesting because I know well, we know you have multiple books out. And it's nice to see how they overlap, how they interlay, what parts are taken from which aspects of your life and whatnot. So it is cool to kind of see the big whiteboard and where it all intersects.
But I will say, you know, when I had a motorcycle, it was before podcasts existed. And so, and before you could, you know, download an audiobook to your phone or whatever very easily, it would be much, those long rides would be way better now, than they were 20 years ago when I was riding.
I guess there would have been something meditative though about the long drives with no music or anything, just the kind of white noise as you're going.
I,
Yeah, that's true, but it's also, you know, when you're in the American South in the summer and
Mhm.
it's 90 something degrees plus the heat of that asphalt pushing up, it's
Oh yeah.
miserable. And so you just get to meditate on how what a terrible decision this was when you could be in an air-conditioned car instead of a motorcycle.
you got all your
And that you got
layers
to
of
ride back as well, man. You got to
yeah.
ride
Yeah,
back.
and then you have to ride back.
You got all your layers of leather on as well. Like, and I've seen so many just along the West Coast. You have the depending on how you're riding, the people that have their handlebars all the way up there. And it's like, man, how do you even turn?
Yeah, and then like the cruisers like I had, and they aren't meant, there's so much nobody's gonna care about this, but you're putting so much pressure on your like your lower back. Like you need, if you're gonna
Uh-huh.
ride long miles, you need a touring bike. And And that's just really the best decision, and everything else is not ideal.
I
Um,
sympathize, man. We recently done the Hajang Loop in Vietnam. It goes up the north of the country into the mountains near the border with China. And it was 3 days on the back of a bike because I'm
Oh,
not good enough at driving motorcycles to go around the mountainside on them with any confidence. And after about 6 hours on the bike the first day, I was like, this was a terrible idea. Why would we do this? It's so uncomfortable. I can't feel anything below my waist. And
yep.
looking back, we don't remember the discomfort or the pain. We just remember the good bits.
Yes.
I got a question about the story, and forgive me, because I forgot the name of the character.
Oh, I probably. Which one is
Yeah,
it?
it's the guy who shows up, the guy that initially kicks the story
Fiacra.
off. Hmm?
Fiacra.
Fiacre, exactly. I was gonna ask.
Is that how you pronounce it?
So again, this is research of like how to figure out
Yeah.
pronunciations.
Yeah,
But that's how I said it in my head. So yeah.
perfect. Um,
I don't
but
know. Know a little bit of Gaelic pronunciation, but Irish is a very different. It's not that different, but it's different enough that I'm not entirely sure. But I was calling him Fiacra as well. He looked like Macho Man Randy Savage in my head, and it was brilliant.
I've got no comment about Irish versus Gaelic here, but I will have to say when it came to Fiacre, was there any sort of worst? I don't want to disparage your clients or anything, but like, did that come from any sort of negative clients you've had in the past, or a combination of it?
No, I think he's attributable to just imagination.
Okay.
Like I wanted this guy to be super charismatic and charming because he's a fairy, but also,
Mhm.
fairies aren't gendered in the way that humans are, or at least, in the way
Yeah.
that I saw it. And so, I wanted him to be somebody that could have an effect on everybody who interacted with him. And so, no, I think I created him out of whole cloth, as best I can tell.
He was a really interesting character because it in just so many different ways. Like, I loved how, because of the no gender dynamic or this or that, he can kind of make himself seem, or make themselves seem however they wanted. And it's this interesting element of shape shifting, but within the real world, and playing this role. Then obviously they go back to the Fae world and assume whatever. Like they had the one person that was a bear, and I really vibed with that. I
I like the bear man.
I like the bear. But it was interesting when you added in that element of, because this is actually a question I had about, is it true you can't eat if you go to the Fey world, or is that something you added to it?
Uh, that's one of the things I found in my research of like that it is not substantive in a way that would benefit us. So, yeah, if I recall correctly, and we're going back a couple years now, but yes, I'm pretty sure that's one of the things that I came across.
When it comes to
Yeah,
your,
I'd seen that before.
sorry.
And you go right.
Oh, no. I was just gonna say, when it comes to your actual writing style, how does it feel? Like, what's the transition or the juxtaposition between writing for contracts as a lawyer versus writing fiction? Has that been a struggle, or has that been fun?
Uh, it has not been a struggle, and it took me a long time to find my voice in writing fiction. Because I did like from the time I was a teenager, I was doing creative writing and writing poetry that in retrospect was really bad. And then in my 20s, writing some short stories. But there was like when I go back and look at a lot of that early stuff, it's hardly even recognizable as myself. A lot of it feels really pretentious and self-important, and written in a way that I don't write now. And so, but part of one in my legal writing, the things that you do too is, a lot of people, you have this archaic way of thinking that lawyers write in ways that you can't understand or that are really difficult to decipher. And there's been a trend really for the last 15 or 20 years in the legal field to get away from that and to write in a way that people can understand as they read it. And for me, I think one of the most important things is word choice, because words have a very particular meaning. And I always want to make sure that I'm choosing the word that best conveys what I want, but also isn't something that requires somebody to burn extra mental calories as they're reading and pulls them out of the story because they're thinking about what that word means, as opposed to, having the necessary connotation of feeling what it means in the flow of the story. And that's not something that I always practiced, but really within the last 10 years or so is something I've worked really hard to incorporate. And a lot of that was learned in listening to podcasts about writing and reading about writing, is making sure that your word choices are right. Like one of the things Mark Twain said is the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between the lightning and the lightning bug. And, I think that's hugely important to me, is picking the right word for the moment, but also a word that fits within the context of the story. Like the one that I'm writing right now, there's several different characters and some of them have different education levels. And parts of the stories are from people with lower education level perspective, and other parts are from more educated. So when I'm writing those, I have to be cognizant of what kind of words would this hillbilly character use, as opposed to the lawyer or the podcaster, who's from Philadelphia. Like what kind of word choices are they going to make when they're just conversing with each other? And so I think I lost the trail of the original question, but I try in both the fiction and the nonfiction context, I want to write in a way that people like they can follow it without having to expend too much energy to go along.
Well, yeah, I think, and obviously it came through. I've never read one of your contracts, but I have to say the fiction aspect of it has been really easy to read.
I
And
can send you some legal briefs if you want, but I don't think you'd find it very compelling.
like obviously diction plays such an important role because none of us want to read a story where, or at least I can only speak for myself. I don't love reading a story where every 30 seconds I got to put the book down and go like have my dictionary nearby and double check what this means or that means. Um, and it is nice because like you said, like, yeah, diction is important. You have to choose the right word here, the right word there. It's almost like a puzzle. Gotta solve it. That being said, I'm not a writer. That's better. That's a better thing for Steve.
I think it's a really underrated part of writing technique that goes unsung most of the time, because big things like similes, metaphors, your voice and everything, your prose, all of those things are downstream from word choice. The word choice creates the vibe. The word choice informs you whether you're reading something that's light-hearted or serious or gothic or horror. Word choice is everything, man. That's really cool though. And I wish we had more time that I could ask you some of the things that you learned when you were studying how to write and stuff. But I've definitely done similar things myself where I think reading really good writers' work and then trying to break down and figure out how they achieve what they achieve is, I think, one of the best things I've tried to do. Who are some of the writers that you would put up there as like what you're trying to be, or who inspired you?
And so this has definitely changed over the years, because I would
Okay.
say in my early 20s, like I loved Ernest Hemingway and John
Oh yeah.
Steinbeck.
Yeah.
But they will have like huge blocks of text. Like, you might have a whole page, and even C.S. Lewis, who I read a lot, he's like this, of like you might have a whole page that is entirely one paragraph. And that, I would try to emulate that when I was younger. More recently, it's guys like John Scalzi and Blake Crouch who write stories that move really quickly. And that's the kind of stories that I want to tell. And, I read Elmore Leonard, and I saw part of an interview with him once where he said, just cut out all the parts that people don't want to read. And that's how he keeps his stories
Yes.
interesting. Right. And so,
Cut out the parts that people skip. Yeah.
yeah, that's it.
Yep. I love that one.
And so, a lot of my writing is dialogue intensive. And I like writing dialogue. A lot of times I have to go back in those second and third drafts to add in action items that I did left out because I just realized we have a
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
page of
Mm.
conversation without much like physically happening. What are the people doing while they're having this conversation? Or
I
adding in
sympathize.
those yeah, the tales about their like emotional state, particularly where it's a first person story or whatever, where you can have that internal dialogue. And I had to go back and add that stuff in later. So I want to write stories that really move, and those are the stories that I enjoy reading. And so yeah, and then like one of the guys that I love reading is Brandon Sanderson, but I don't write at
Yeah.
all like he writes, other than I think even though some of his stories are like 400,000 words, he's focused on like moving the story his as well, even though it's gargantuan. And so yeah, that's what those are the guys that when I read them, particularly with John Scalzi and Blake Crouch, I'm like, that's the kind of stories, the structure, how I want to formulate it.
So
Yeah.
I hate being that person because we have about 2.5 minutes left here, and I want to make sure everyone gets what they need here. So if you were a reader and you liked Casual Business with Fairies, what's the best way for readers to get a hold of you? What should they read next of yours? Give us your website, all of that.
Yeah, so my website is jwjudge.com, and you can find everything there.
Mm.
If you search me on any of the socials, that's also under JW Judge. My most recent novel that came out in April of this year is called Watch Party. It's about a group of people who survive a plane crash on a deserted island and then start disappearing one by one. And it's kind of Agatha Christie meets Lost. But it's more
Yeah, man.
straight thriller suspense story without any of the fantastical elements.
Okay, and it's fair share of contracts.
No lawyers in this one.
No,
Yeah,
they all disappear first.
they all got
Um,
killed.
no, that sounds like an amazing story, honestly. I've always loved the survivalist ones, but no, so we will add all of the website, socials, and stuff in the, I hate saying it, but in the description below. Um, and yeah, we've got about a minute left, and I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, can I
Yes,
do my
ask, go.
final?
Do your final
Can I
thing.
do my final? Was it okay? We play a game called Was It Deliberate? This was the only one that I had for this. For those who don't know, the Judge is a pen name. Was that a deliberate pen name choice because you're a lawyer?
Not because I'm a lawyer, but
Damn it.
I chose a pen name because I'm a lawyer, and I have a bunch of legal writing that I do. And so I didn't want, when clients go to Google me, I needed them to find the
Oh,
lawyer stuff. So that's why I went with the pen name. My last name, Richter, is German. German Richter means judge, and so that's why I went with Judge as the last name there.
I love
So
it.
it all ties in nicely,
That
just not exactly in the way that you were asking.
that's
That's
fantastic.
perfect, man. I love the
Well,
trivia.
if you manage to make it 40 minutes into an interview and you forgot what we're talking about, just thank you again, JW Judge, Jeremy, and that was Casual Business with Fairies.
Amazing book.
Thank you.
We got another second.